The most famous and provocative intellectuals on the planet right now. He's a psychologist, normally works out of the University of Toronto. He was thrust into the public eye back in 2016 after refusing to obey a diktat ordering him to refer to trans people by their preferred pronouns, and he's since become something of a countercultural warrior, I suppose, critiquing political correctness and the idea of an oppressive patriarchy, the notion of the gender pay gap. Even his interview with Channel 4 News anchor Cathy Newman back in January, what an interview that was, has been viewed more than 10 million times, and no wonder, because Jordan's clear, calm rationale certainly got us thinking, or he certainly got me thinking. And having watched some of your televised lectures, they won't be talking about this on ITV at the moment, I believe that you believe that there is some kind of Marxist-influenced, post-modernist plot that's hatching in our universities. Hatched in our universities. To do what? What is this conspiracy?
Well, the stated goals of the conspiracy, so to speak, can be found on the websites of disciplines like women's studies. It's to bring down the oppressive patriarchal structure of the West. And that's a deadly serious aim by all means possible, including an assault on the basic categories that we use to orient ourselves in the world. And so the theory is driven by the idea that the best way to construe Western civilization is as a power structure basically produced by men for men that's fundamentally oppressive and that needs to be dismantled from the bottom up. And so it's easy to find out what the aim is because it's stated very clearly, to produce activists to bring that about. And that's especially true of disciplines like women's studies and the cultural studies disciplines.
You hate those courses, don't you?
Well, it's not so much that I hate them, it's that I'm embarrassed to be part of the university because of what the universities are doing. You claim
that there's sort of pseudoscience or false science.
It's not a claim. It's absolutely the case that it's not even, you can't even call it pseudoscience because it's not science. It's just driven by a set of ideological presuppositions, the most pernicious of which is that the best way to understand history and understand people is as a consequence of their group identity, which is unbelievably dangerous because what it does is push us back towards a tribal direction. You know, one of the things that I love about England, about the UK in general, is that over the course of any reasonable historical development, Britain developed the idea of the sovereignty of the individual and instantiated that into the political system. So that the notion was that you should always view people as individuals first and as members of a collective, if at all, far second. And that's what accounts for the spread of freedom and productivity and democracy throughout the world. And the universities are doing everything they can to critique that at the most fundamental level possible, all in the name of some false compassion and hypothetical equality.
Come on, Sophie. I voted for your party. I voted for you in the London mayoral elections. What do you say to that? What do you say to that?
Well, I suppose my question is, you call yourself a sort of classic British liberal. And I was very interested to see that description of you. And I'm also fascinated by your book about, dealing with the chaos in which, as you yourself say, men find themselves in, or it's predominantly aimed at men.
No,
and
it's
I think
not,
that. Oh well, I'd read an article with you in which you sort of said, well, yes, it probably is mainly men. So that's what I'm basing that on. I think so. Taking all that into account, why do you think it is that so much of what you say is so very popular with the alt-right?
It isn't. And you don't have any evidence for that at all. More than the evidence that alt-right people watch this show.
Neo-Nite website, Saviour of Western Civilization.
Oh, well, that was all taken apart today by a number of Jewish publications, by the way, showing that, first of all, that was all satirical commentary on the part of the alt-right, directed at taking me down, for example. And there was an alt-right article yesterday published saying that I was a Jewish stooge and shill. So this is absolute nonsense, and I don't appeal primarily to the alt-right. There's no evidence for that at all. It's the proclivity of.
I never said primarily, Jordan. What I'm interested in is why you think that you get the reaction that you do from the alt-right. Looking at the Cathy Newman documentary.
What reaction?
Interview.
There's 10 million people watched that and commented on it.
I'm talking about what I saw, and I'm curious to know what your reaction was to the glee with which the alt-right seized upon that interview.
I don't accept
Shall we deal with the death threats? I mean, she had, I think, a dozen.
I don't accept the concept that it was the alt-right that was doing this. There were 10 million people who commented on that video, and about 95% of them commented negatively on Cathy Newman's behaviour. You think there's 10 million alt-right trolls watching that?
Did you not? You accused her of
that wasn't
spinning
at all
a
what I
victim narrative in an interview with the Radio Times.
You mean what Kathy did afterwards?
yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Well,
That's exactly what happened.
But wasn't that because Kathy Newman, for quite a while, and she's a great accomplished journalist,
Well
just
said.
sat there looking at you with her mouth open and slowly closing like a goldfish because she didn't know what to say. And so she was coming back afterwards and making the point, well, actually, I did know what to say, but I was giving you time, or words that
But given that she said, I'm going to find that and kill her, I'm going to find that and execute her. Is that spinning a victim narrative when you get that popping up in your Twitter inbox?
Well, it depends on what happened with Channel 4 was that they put the whole interview up, which was quite a shock to me because I didn't think they would. And then people were vitriolically opposed to what had happened. And so there were hundreds of thousands of comments. And when you get hundreds of thousands of comments, there's going to be some subset like this. And people did analysis of these comments, by the way, and showed that the bulk of the ones that were vitriolic in terms of percentages were actually directed at me, not at her. And it was in the best interests of the Channel 4 people to spin this as a victim narrative, because that's what they do anyways, but to construe Kathy Newman, who's...
Did you get death threats, though?
I've had death threats. I don't know if I got them specifically because of that interview, because I hadn't said anything contentious, but that certainly happened to me. And seriously enough, so the university increased security around my office. But I mean, when you're dealing with people, when you're dealing with millions of people's comments, then there's going to be a percentage of them that are produced by people who are, well, not mentally well to begin with. And I also tweeted out afterwards. You know, after this had gone on for a couple of days, I tweeted out something asking people to lay off her because enough was enough.
Yes, you did. Yes.
But I can tell you from my own experience that about half the people on Twitter are not mentally well. So that goes as standard.
Yeah, well, it's about 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 in the general population. Right. So, you know, you're going to expect
I think it's
comments.
well, I mean, actually, I remember the former government chief whip, Patrick McLaughlin, saying, and he's a great man, he says that about a third of the UK population, and this is a serious point, have some form of mental illness. And he was saying to me that as a government chief whip, we're always being told that MPs should represent the general population, and there is no doubt that there's an over-representation among MPs in that area.
That's something for you.
Well, that's a good thing.
I'll probably now get a lot of Twitter hatred mail for
Forgive me, because I've got to jump in, because it seems only fair, as we dragged Jordan over from Canada, that we should mention this. This is the 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos. Rule number 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back. Now, the question I've written is, how is that an antidote to chaos? I share that view. I think if you carry yourself, you project confidence, and confidence wins people over.
I think not only does it win people over, it orients you properly in the world. I mean, to stand up straight with your shoulders back is actually to adopt a stance that in some sense is maximally vulnerable. It's not a defensive crouch. It sort of exposes you to the world. And the clinical literature on that sort of thing is clear. If you want to move towards mental health, then what you want to do is voluntarily confront the things that you're afraid of and are avoiding. And so it's a matter of courage, not of power, and of willingness to take on your own vulnerability and fragility. And that does broadcast that confidence to other people, and that's a good way of making your way through life.
I have to say, by the way, compared to some of the more academic pieces you can see on Twitter, this is quite an easy read, quite engaging, so thank you for that.
Yeah,
very easy read.
That's good.
It made me sit up straight, by the way, as you were saying it.
There we go.
Glad to hear.
That's good.
Now,
That's
Sophie,
Yes.
you told my researcher that Donald Trump is your chief recruiting officer.
Yes.
How so?
Well, I mean, you know, we set this party up 3 years ago because we saw what has subsequently been the case, that we saw it coming, this big upsurge of reclaiming space for women, if you like. There's a huge frustration that so much of our politics doesn't reflect women's lives, doesn't reflect women's experiences. And that has a really negative impact in the policy making that happens. We only have to look at the impact of austerity, for example, 10 years of austerity policies that had an overwhelmingly disproportionate impact on women. Women paid 85p in every pound. So women were basically being asked to pay the national debt through those cuts to benefits to changes to the tax system. And so what we wanted to say was, look, actually, this system is broken. It's not working. There's a lot of chaos, as Jordan points out. There's a lot of people feeling frustrated and unhappy and that their voices aren't being heard.
And Trump, how does he fit into this?
Well, because I think Trump is the perfect example that progress is not linear, right? And when power is threatened, it doubles down and protects itself by insisting that by sort of exaggerating. We've got a very exaggerated version now of white male power in Trump, and actually what's happened is that has had. I think that has had a positive impact in terms of galvanising the women's movement.
Okay.
And there is an understanding that we have to not just protect the rights and protections that we want and we have, but we have to continue to protect them against attempts to dismantle them, as we're seeing in America, where women's reproductive rights are being rolled back by state after state after state. But we also have to continue to confront intolerance and discomfort, and make sure that we are bringing people into the conversation. And that's really what I'm trying to do in this job. I am trying to offer different choices.
Okay, I get that. Now, is it a problem for Brexit, Scotland's vote?
Well, look, I grew up in Scotland, and I think there's an awful lot of people in Scotland who are pretty fed up with watching people in London telling them what they want. And I also think that what we're essentially seeing again is concern about, the Brexit splits that we see throughout the country being reflected throughout different parts of different countries.
The
Scotland
poll,
and
by
England,
the way, was done in Scotland, so it's not me.
No.
I'm just saying what the poll in Scotland said.
But the point I'm trying to make is that the UK government keeps using Brexit as a way to shore up its centralised power. And I think, the Women's Equality Party wrote an amendment to the Article 50 bill that got the broadest cross-party support of any of the amendments to that bill, because what we said was we have to ensure that this goes through Parliament, right? So when we take off the EU framework, all that secondary legislation is in danger of simply being overseen by ministers and civil servants, not by Parliament. And we have to have parliamentary scrutiny. We have to allow devolved parliaments to have their say. And I think
But how do you resolve a devolved Parliament saying, stuff your Brexit, and a UK Westminster government saying, you're going to have it whether you like it or not?
Well, I think I think you have to create a framework to have a conversation, and that's the problem. I mean, to
be fair, both sides have said they're still open to negotiation.
Right, absolutely. But what Theresa May keeps saying is that you can have what we're going to let you have, and the rest we're going to have. And there's all this narrative about taking back control, which is really hypocritical, because if we're going to take back control, it's taking back control to Parliament and to parliamentary scrutiny.
But you said most of the powers are going to be devolved back.
Most of them are, but you could argue that agriculture, fisheries, industry payments are some of the biggies.
But don't we have to have a united fisheries policy? Don't we have to have a united agriculture policy?
If all the good cod fishing was in Scotland, the Scottish people think, well, why will I have to share it with Westminster government that history has shown decade after decade treats us like the poor relative in the United Kingdom, Michael?
I mean, look, you either have devolution or you don't.
Right.
You don't have a bit of devolution except for when it suits you. I mean,
so should Scotland have their own foreign policy and own army?
Jordan, welcome to our united... I'm not sure how united we are.
Well, it's a sad thing to see from a Canadian perspective, because, we suffered through endless referenda in Canada for about a 30-year period when Quebec was deciding whether to leave or not, and it didn't do us any good at all. And, from the outside...
What do you mean by that? Can you be more specific? And
how it was very hard on the currency. It was very hard on the country's confidence.
So it affected economics, affected people's wages, therefore?
It affected our national unity. It introduced the idea of group identity into our politics in a terrible way, because...
Tribalism, for want of another word.
Absolutely. I mean, we muddled through
We have that now with Brexit, don't we? Roughly half the country wants to leave and roughly half the country wants to stay.
That's why...
Jordan, mobile phones at night.
Well, it's definitely the case that you have to pay attention to your sleep hygiene and your times of eating if you want to stay not depressed and not anxious. The question with this article is it people who look at their cell phones who get depressed, or is it depressed people who tend to look at their cell phones at night? And it's very, very difficult to tease that apart in that kind of scientific study.
This is why I love you, because I'm thinking it's so obvious. Oh, it's always people checking their phones, and now you've just completely thrown a spanner in the works up here.
Yeah, well,
But it's just...
Well, lots of times people who are depressed, say, or anxious, aren't really that tired at night because their sleep and so then they're casting around for things to do. And it's also possible that that would make it worse. I mean, I think that before you go to sleep, the sleep hygiene studies show that you should, detach yourself as much as you can from your daily concerns and start to shut down. So I think it's a reasonable piece of advice anyways.
Yeah.
But I don't think that you can draw a causal conclusion that it's causing depression or anxiety.
It could be the other way around.
Yeah.
Back to you, Jordan.
All right.
What's your next story?
After-school clubs harm family life. Well, that's a fairly easy thing to deal with, I would say, is that parents aren't obliged to wear themselves to an unsustainable frazzle trying to either amuse or provide opportunities for their kids. I mean, when you're setting up your family, you have to think about what it is that you can sustain without resentment, that you can sustain happily day after day. And you don't want to bring undue hardship to your family or undue stress by scrambling constantly to make sure that your kids have a hypothetical advantage.
Impacting on relationships within families, and finances within families. Now you say...
all the time for driving and organising, and it's hard on the kids often.
But I thought the whole idea of after-school activities was that maybe the school curriculum as stands is narrow and academic, and there's a whole world out there.
Well, there is.
The arts and other sports and music and so on. And you need to get your kids to do that, and you have to do it after school.
Well, right, but you don't want to do it so much that you can't do it, so that you hate it,
so
that you're always
back
in
on
the
the
car.
activities.
Yeah, well, you have to decide in a reasonable sense, and you should talk to your partner about this if you're fortunate enough to have one, just exactly what's sustainable over the long run, and you shouldn't allow guilt about the possibility of a missed opportunity on behalf of your children to drive you into a position that makes you dreadfully unhappy and destabilizes your family.
I think there's also a really practical thing here, which is that, school time, the sort of 9 till 3, is still based on an idea that there's going to be a mum to pick kids up at 3, and that's increasingly not the case. And so a lot of the time, after-school provision is really vital for families who are trying to balance work and family life.
But political correctness, is it a force for good, or is it the tyrant's friend, limiting freedom of expression and ultimately, I guess, freedom of thought? Having done this show for more than 18 years now, I do feel that freedom of speech is more under threat than before. But equally, no one would want to go back to the dark days when you had black and white characters on TV shows like Love Thy Neighbour, racially abusing each other on primetime telly for entertainment, as we did in the early 70s. Race riots in the later 70s and early 80s gave the establishment a badly needed wake-up call, but my brothers and sisters of colour, still discriminated against, still more likely to be stopped by police, paid nearly, I think, $9,000 less than an average household. They've got fewer nominations for BAFTA gongs if you're looking at representation. I'd still like to think things are moving in the right direction, and I'd like to think that other minorities, LGBT people, disabled people, whatever, are getting a fairer crack of the whip than they used to as well, although disabled people still have to apply, I think, for 60% more jobs than non-disabled people before they get one. Now, we've got laws to help. Racial hatred was outlawed by the Public Order Act, 86. The 2010 Equalities Act protects people from discrimination on grounds of race, sex, religion, age, sexual orientation, disability, pregnancy, maternity, marriage and gender reassignment, not how fat you are, and, well, not yet anyway. Political correctness, though, goes way beyond that. You might remember Sir Tim Hunt, the Nobel Prize-winning biologist. He was forced to resign his university post after making a comment, he says a joke, about women crying in laboratories. Another academic, Professor Richard Ned Lebow from King's College London, has this week been ordered to apologise after jokingly reply women's lingerie when asked in a lift which floor he'd like to get out on. The complaint was brought by another academic, Simona Sharoni, Professor of Women's and Gender Studies, I'm sure that's something we'll talk about in a moment, who says she was left shaken by the misogynistic incident. Lebow has so far refused to apologise, saying such a frivolous complaint risks diverting attention from real offences, the exploitation, the coercion or humiliation of women. Whatever you think of that row, a much more serious example of PC gone mad, again, I would suggest would centre on the large-scale abuse of children by predominantly Asian gangs in places like Rotherham, where investigators found countless officials turned a blind eye, fearful of being labelled racist if they took action. I could go on. Mr. Men books, Tom and Jerry, The Simpsons, pantomimes, sombreros, have all been found in the crosshairs of various PC campaigns. Force for good or bad, PC?
Well, I think at the moment it's clearly a force for bad. I think it's corrupted the universities, perhaps beyond repair. And I think the reason for that fundamentally is that the PC ideologue types think that the proper way to classify people is by their group affiliation. And there's all sorts of problems with that. One is that there's an endless number of ways that you can classify people by their group affiliation. And that's actually a big technical problem. But more importantly, you need a kind of broad story to tell people about how they should interact with the world. And the story in the West has been that you should fundamentally treat people like the individual is sovereign. And our political system is predicated on that extraordinary and difficult to attain ideal. And to replace that with a collectivist narrative means that we're pushed back into tribal warfare, essentially.
I grew up watching Love Thy Neighbour, and when I look back on it now, it's extraordinary. The one that people just abuse themselves, and that was held up as entertainment. Surely, political correctness, we have something to be thankful for, that people abusing each other for the colour of their skin as entertainment on television is a thing of the past. That is a good effect of
Well, I don't think that you can attribute that to political correctness. I think that you can. Well, I think that there's been a move over centuries for us to continue to push the idea of the value of each individual into broader and broader domains, to bring everybody under that umbrella. That's been going on probably since the end of the Roman Empire. And to associate that continual improvement with modern PC culture, I think, is a mistake. I mean, the idea of individual sovereignty is deeply embedded in the Judeo-Christian ethic, and it's manifested itself slowly in the political realm over that 2,000-year period. And I think perhaps that's even accelerated over the last 50 years as we become more aware of the necessity of producing situations that allow for equality of opportunity, and to note that that's a social good for everyone. But I'm not willing to credit the neo-Marxist, postmodern, politically correct types with an increase in racial tolerance and gender tolerance and so forth across our culture. I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, the abolition of slavery a couple of hundred years ago was hardly driven by PC culture. So the PC types are going to want to take credit for that, but I don't think there's any reason to assume that they're doing anything but dividing us.
Slightly tangential, but freedom of speech. In this country, you have freedom of speech within the confines of the law. Is there any other way of having a freedom of speech? We have to exist within some confines, or sometimes I do wonder whether it would just be easier we just said, to hell with the law, say what you want, deal with it, whatever.
Well, the problem is that people don't think through what freedom of speech means, because they tend to think it means the right to criticize those who are in power, for example, which is one of the things it means. But freedom of speech actually means the freedom to formulate ideas badly and awkwardly in public while you're trying to think them through.
Including offending people?
Well, it's inevitable that you're going to offend people if you're going to talk about anything difficult, because if you talk about something difficult, then people are going to become emotionally involved. And that's especially true if you talk to large numbers of people about something difficult. Like if I address an audience of 1,000 people about anything vaguely contentious, which is obviously something that needs to be thought about, then the small percentage of them are going to be offended. And so what that means is that as your audience scales, or as the importance of the topic increases, your ability to say anything decreases. That's not good.
Just forgive me just for one moment, sir, because I know a little bit about this and I think it might be helpful. Tell me about Bill C-16 and this is Canadian law now. What was it? What was your problem with it? What happened? As quickly.
Well, what happened was that under the rubric of laws that purported to extend reasonable protection provisions to transgender people, for example, the government decided that it was okay to regulate adjectives of a certain type to describe people. And I felt that that was an inappropriate intrusion of the political into the domain of rights, because free speech is the capital right as far as I'm concerned. And it was the willingness of the government to institute compelled speech as a legislative necessity that was what I objected to, because I thought it was a terrible precedent. And I do think it was a terrible precedent. We've had scandals in Canada. Biggest university scandal that ever hit Canada was a direct consequence of Bill C-16 being passed into law. So where a teaching assistant named Lindsay Shepherd was excoriated by her Maoist professors for daring to show a clip of me discussing exactly the sort of thing we're discussing right now in a communications class at Wilfrid Laurier University.
political correctness restricting freedom of thought, Sophie?
Well, I mean, Jordan's dead right when he says that this is people are worried about offending people. That there is this idea that we can't, we might say the wrong thing and we're only going to get ourselves into trouble. And we've got to find a better way to deal with that, because tolerance is really hard, right? If it was easy, we would have done it by now.
Maybe it's impossible
and I think,
to be tolerant, entirely tolerant.
I think actually, possibly, but I think we can do better. Right. And I think that what essentially this is about is being comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? And I think that freedom of speech assumes equal volume of speech for everybody involved, and we know that that's not the case, right? When you only have to look at Women in Journalism survey.
Freedom of speech doesn't assume equal volume of speech for everyone.
Can I just finish the point I'm making? There are when we look at the Women in Journalism survey that found that 78% of front page stories are written by men, and 84% of those stories are about men. And so often the two things get confused as to saying, well, if I speak, if that person speaks, then I can't speak. And that goes to what I was saying earlier about how a backlash is also what was essentially a backlash against the people who are in power.
Yes.
Then often becomes the people in power intellectualizing the backlash to protect the status quo and say, no, you don't understand, this is just how it is. And that's what we have to reject.
Can I ask you about the lift scenario, the two academics in the lift? Should he apologise? Is there anything to apologise for?
Well, I think what you said about this is really interesting. Your comment about then going into the spectrum, that what we do very quickly is, and we've seen this with the Me Too movement. I've been asked to talk an awful lot about Me Too and sexual harassment, and what happens there is that people will say, it's just a hand on the knee, for goodness sake, why aren't we talking about rape?
Yeah.
And my answer in those scenarios is, this is the only time we ever talk about rape properly, when it's used to beat people over the head for complaining about a lesser offence.
Well, is it an offence? You call it an offence. What is the offence?
I'm talking about sexual harassment.
No, but I'm talking about the bloke. I'm talking about the bloke in the lift using a line from "Are you being served?" Isn't it?
I mean, we all have different. We all personally have different levels of what's okay. But my point is, to that woman in the lift, to have a guy making a joke about, I'd like to get out one of the women's underwear. I mean, it's cheesy beyond belief. But for her, that might have been like a part of a spectrum which she deals with every day in terms of whether it's sexual harassment.
She said as much. I think she herself had been a victim.
So my point is that let's join the dots. Let's join the dots. Let's make space for different voices. But let's also understand that enabling us, it's not. The whole stuff about C16, right? It wasn't actually about pronouns. It was about making sure that trans people don't get killed.
No, it was about pronouns.
Like the theorising that Jordan did about, if I were to use this, then I might get fined, then I could go to jail, then I could... Actually, you don't have to... You can look at that kind of law, and you can understand the broader point that it's trying to make, which is that, black people should not be being harassed by the police. Women should not be experiencing workplace sexual harassment. Trans people should not be experiencing violence. You can understand all that.
That doesn't mean the government should be compelling speech.
Still understand your right as an individual.
And besides, the university itself...
political correctness, and it was a government attempt to control speech in Canada.
And the university actually sent me letters telling me to cease and desist talking about it, because the university itself judged that I was probably breaking the new laws. So it's not something hypothetical.
I think there are some real cases of where free speech is seriously being threatened, and I'd love to see Jordan take those up, such as Republican lawmakers of Wisconsin who are introducing bills that will ensure that students who heckle speakers in state universities are to be expelled or suspended. That is threatening free speech, and I'd love Jordan to take up the cudgels on that one.
Just 1 in 9 nurses are male, and yet there are 38,000 NHS nursing jobs going begging. Are sexist job titles to blame for fellas not taking up these roles, or are other factors to play? Nurses' starting salary, 22 grand a year, not a lot when you factor in you'll be working long shifts, irregular hours, the fact violence against NHS workers is on the rise. Davies has other ideas to drive up numbers of male nurses, including seeing more men cast in more male nurses cast in TV dramas like Casualty, and my own favourite suggestion, more fancy dress nurse costumes for boys. Will any of this drive up applications from geezers, Michael?
Well, you've raised some very good points there. I have to say, just to be a little bit flippant, I still love Hattie Jakes when she was in the Carry On movies.
As matron.
As matron, and, that's someone you can respect. But it was very interesting when you said, actually, that the reintroduction of matron increase the number of nurses
Couple of years
joining.
later,
But we have to be very careful about what names we do use. I just want to make this point because, you know, junior doctors, for example, used to be called consultants. And junior doctor sounds as if you haven't even qualified yet in medical school.
So terms are important.
Terms are important. I do think it's very much the points that you made, which are the factors putting off men and boys from joining the nursing profession rather than the name. But if it turns out to be the name, then let's change it. But think about it very carefully about what name we decide to use.
Jordan?
Well, you should be able to tell already, because if in Scotland the name has already been changed and there's a higher proportion of men in Scotland being nurses, then you have some evidence that the name change worked. So this is pretty much an empirical question. But it sounds to me like a radical oversimplification of the problem, because you have a preponderance of female nurses in most countries, including in Scandinavia, where everything is done to make the genders as equal as possible. Still an overwhelming preponderance of women compared to men in nursing.
Is it something like, I think it's 50-1 in nursing for women, and in engineering 50-1?
No, it's not that extreme. It's 20 to 1, if I
20.
remember correctly, with nursing, and 5-1 with engineers. Okay. And that's been very stable in Scandinavia for a number of decades, despite what the government's trying to do about it.
That said, Sophie,
yes.
I mean, maybe it's just me, generation my age, but matron does sound terribly old-fashioned. And regardless of the argument about getting men into nursing, I just think the title matron probably go to the bin.
Well, there's 2 points I would like to make, if I may. The first is to pick up on Jordan's last point about Scandinavia, where, you know, they're much further ahead in terms of gender equality than anywhere else. Women are still sort of choosing gendered roles. There's a very interesting piece of Canadian research, actually, which shows that when women go to apply for jobs, they are less likely to apply for jobs that use traditionally masculine words like leadership and competition, and not because they don't think they can do the job, but because they think they won't be welcome in that environment because it will be a male-heavy environment. And the reverse applies for men too.
Yes.
So there is something about men seeing nursing as female. However, I would like to say, as my second point, that when we live in a situation where, under a Conservative government, nurses are using food banks, it is far more likely that it is pay and conditions that are keeping people, men and women, and we know it's women too, because we know that the number of nurses that are leaving, it's like 7 in 10 are leaving their NHS trusts. We have a vast, huge problem with nursing, which we need to address by investing in it properly. As I was saying earlier, we have a workforce crisis. We have no workforce strategy. Nuffield estimates that with current demographics, we need something like 275,000 jobs by 2025. Where is the plan to fill those spaces?
What do you understand by equality, Sophie? What does it mean to you?
Freedom.
Can you be more... Is it equality of opportunity? Is it equal pay across the board? Is it something more than that?
I think equality's better for everyone. I think, you know, and I'm really delighted, you know, I love my job because it's an optimistic and a hopeful job, which is about creating more choices for people. I'm interested in people being able to have different choices and having equality of outcome.
Aha, well, so you're going to have choices and equality of outcome. What if people choose different things, which is what they've been doing in Scandinavia? So the Scandinavian countries have moved more towards gender equality than any other countries, and the personality differences in Scandinavia have increased rather than decreased, and the proportion of women who are choosing STEM fields has decreased rather than increased. So as cultures become more gender neutral, the number of women who choose STEM fields decreases.
What do you mean by STEM fields?
So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So if you let men and women make their choices, what actually happens is that they specialize in different situations, and you don't get equality of outcome.
Could they not have been programmed to have those views from the moment we raise them and give boys Lego and construction?
No, because what happens is that as countries get more egalitarian, which means there's less programming of that sort, the differences get larger, not smaller. And the scientific data on that is clear, and most of it was generated by people who have a left-leaning bias, so you can't blame it on conservative scientists. It was a shock to everyone to find that out.
Sophie,
I think the difference between Jordan and me is that we look at evidence and we lean towards different theories. So Jordan's theory is very much evolutionary, you know, that there are inherent differences in men and women. Mine is very much more social role theory, if you like, and that men and women are taking on different roles due to the expectations that society puts on them. And it's interesting that Jordan frequently cites Scandinavian countries where they've made more, like there's nowhere in the world that women are equal, but Scandinavia has made the most progress towards shared parenting, etc.
Yep.
That said, it's not done yet. There's nowhere in the world where this is done yet.
But it's having the opposite effect that the gender equality types predicted. Opposite, not the same.
No,
and it isn't a theory, it's actually data driven by tens of thousands of surveys and the best scientific literature on the topic. It's not a theory, and I didn't come about it because of my political perspective. I looked at the data. What it showed was that as countries become more egalitarian, the differences between men and women grow. They don't shrink.
So what I'm interested in is data and analysis as well. And I'm particularly interested in the ones presented, such as the ones by the University of Southern California, which discovered that change towards gender equality is actually being slowed by beliefs that are legitimizing social inequalities on the basis of sex. And I'm also interested, I mean, like Jordan, I look at the data and I look at the studies, and I'm really also very much interested in studies like the analysis that was done by the American Psychological Society, which looked at 45 analysis of whether there's sex difference over 20 years. And its conclusion was that men and women are basically alike in terms of personality, in terms of cognitive ability, in terms of leadership. But what it did find was that media depictions of men and women as fundamentally different perpetuate misconceptions, as does workplace bias.
Oh, God, so it's my fault.
So, no, well, you know, you're leaving soon. It's okay.
Men and women actually are more the same than they are different. But the issue is that small differences at the population level can turn into very large differences at the extreme. So, for example, men and women are broadly similar with regards to aggression, although men tilt a little bit more towards aggression. So that if you picked a random person out of the population, male and female, and you guessed that the male was more aggressive, you'd be right 60% of the time. But if you take the 1 in 100 most aggressive people, they're all male. And that's why the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that, just out of curiosity? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male. And we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? And men work longer hours. They work more dangerous jobs. They're more likely to move. They're more likely to work outside. They're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable. They make more money for those reasons. And that's all hidden under the idea that the reason that men and women make different amounts of money is because of their gender. It's a very simplistic analysis, and trying to
Michael,
address...
I was just going to say, Sophie, can you come back on that?
What I'm trying to equalise is opportunity and choice.
Fine, let's equalise choice.
You agree on that.
But we won't get equal outcome that way.
And I think that what happens then, nobody knows, because we've never done it yet.
We do know. We know what's happened in Scandinavia.
But it's not fully got there yet.
No, but it's going in the opposite direction that everyone predicted, and strongly.
I think one of the things I loved about Jordan's book, which I speed read last night, so forgive me, Jordan, I've not read every line. But one of my favourite rules in Jordan's book is Rule 9, which says, assume the person you are listening to might know something you don't. And I think that in a country where men outnumber women by 2 to 1 in Parliament, in local government, where women's voices are not equally represented in media, where our education systems still are teaching boys and girls ideas of pink and blue. What I'm trying to do is work with thousands of optimistic, hopeful people for change.
Okay.